Okay, Lou.
Well, very excited to introduce my colleague, Dr. Cassidy Sugimoto. She is a professor and the Tom and Marie Patton School Chair in the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech. And she studies how knowledge is produced and disseminated and consumed and supported, with an emphasis on issues of diversity and equity and inclusion. And so she is she was the program director for Science to Science at the National Science Foundation for several years leading up to 2020. And she's received a number of awards, which I won't embarrass her by mentioning all of them, but you should hear her play her music, and I'll just say that. So without further ado, again, very happy to introduce Cassidy Sugimoto, who will be speaking to us today on, let me get the title up here, Disparities, what was it? Oh, now I lost the tab. Oh, I was doing so well. Thank you, there we go. Institutionalization of disparities in science. That's what I was gonna say. Thank you, Cassidy.
Thanks so much, Lou. I thought I would just help you out there. Well, I'm delighted to be here today to chat, as Lou said, to talk a little bit about my research on disparities in science. Most of my work takes a really macro level view using largely publication data and other large-scale survey data in order to understand questions about science. And a lot of those questions, I'm often looking at who gets to produce science, how they get to produce science, how they're rewarded for the science they produce. So I'll talk a little bit about that here. I did prepare this as sort of a formal talk, but given this community and the interest, the other things that all of you are doing, feel free to interrupt me early and often. I'd love to have this be a conversation or a dialogue. So because it's hard for me to see the chat while I'm presenting, feel free to just, Lou, if you want to interrupt me or just jump in, I welcome that at any time. So I'll go ahead with that and get started. So I'm going to go through several milestones, these pivotal moments in science where we see certain barriers that are constructed that lead to the systemic exclusion and inclusion of certain populations. So we'll look at doctoral education, we'll look at authorship, that is actually going on a scientific paper on the byline, contributorship, what you do to warrant that place on the byline, how those pieces are reviewed, the impact that they receive when they go out into the scientific community. And then we'll look at funding, which you could argue should go at the very beginning of this conversation, but I will put it at the end here. And through all these things, I like to think about the consequences of diversity. Many times we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion from a justice perspective. That is, it is good to do these things. It is good for the individual. But I also like to think about how it's good for science. What are the consequences to science and to the space of inquiry when we have diversity within the scientific workforce? So I'm going to look at two different examples of that. So we'll get started with doctoral education, which arguably is the socialization aspect into science, how someone becomes a scientist in an occupational sense. And this data draws from two different sources. One is the bibliometric sources that I use a lot, Web of Science. I think everyone here is familiar with that. And the other is the data that's produced by the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics in the United States under the National Science Foundation. And there are two surveys that they have, the Survey of Earned Doctorates and the Survey of Doctoral Recipients. And these are amazing treasure troves of data. If you haven't played with them before, you really should. So the Survey of Earned Doctorates is truly a census. Many survey responses, you're excited if you get 30 or 40 or maybe even 60% response rates. This is nearly 100% response rate. It truly is a census. And it tells you people who received a doctorate in the US, where they were born, where they received their undergraduate degree, where they did any master's degrees, if any, before they received their doctorate, things about whether they're a first-generation college student, the discipline in which they are, the career paths that they're going into, the salaries that they may have already been offered. I mean, just a wealth of data that's there. And then the National Science Foundation does a cross-sectional thing where they continue surveys and have been surveying people since 1973, which gives you a quasi-diachronic analysis of careers. So again, amazing data that can be used to inform our understanding of the scientific workforce. So while I was at the National Science Foundation, we were able to have access to these and de-anonymized so that we could match them with Web of Science and really look at the publication history matched with all of this rich sociodemographic data and other information that's gathered in these surveys. And so if we just look at this, we can see disparities in the doctoral graduates. Many of you have probably seen this or this data presented in a different way. And what we can see is that white men are overrepresented in the biological, agricultural sciences, physical sciences, social and psychological sciences, with Asian men overrepresented in engineering. Hispanic and Black men underrepresented in all fields. If we look at women, we see higher representation in biological, agricultural, sociological, and psychological sciences. Asian women, like Asian men, more represented in engineering relative to other areas, and then low levels of graduates from Hispanic and Black populations among women as well. But then we took a really simple cut. What we wanted to see is the binary distinction of having a publication. If you had a publication before you graduated from your PhD, and then 6 years after your PhD, what were the implications for your path into a research and development field, either within academia or outside of it? And if you look there on the side, you can see that just having a publication, a single publication before you graduate, is a massive predictor for going into R&D as your first job. And then having another one 6 years later was also very strongly predictive of staying in R&D, which suggests that that socialization into research in the form of an authorship on a scientific publication is a very strong predictor and very highly related to staying in and attrition in the scientific workforce. Now, if we look at this, the odds of having a publication do not fall equally by race or gender. So if you look in the pre-doctorate publishing over in A, we see that Asian, Black, Hispanic scholars are much less likely to have a publication than their white counterparts, and women are much less likely to have it than men. Now, if you look at the other side, 6 years after they graduate, you see that those error bars are really large. There are very few differences by race or gender that we can pull out statistically to say whether these differences exist, which suggests that that really pivotal moment happens during doctoral education, the point in which they get socialized into research, and that that has systemic differences across race and gender lines. Now we took, yeah, go ahead.
Back up real quick. Is that? Can you go back one? Is that computer? What the one that seems to
it's
be
computer
doing
science? Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Computer science. You see the very large error bars. The amount of Black graduates that you have in computer science is very low. So those error bars are really large in that area.
Okay. Okay. Oh, same with women, probably. Okay.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then
so the pink error bars here. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? So we took everything on this. I know. Yeah. So we took all this data from the survey and we said, okay, what is then the biggest predictor of having that publication? And if we account for whether you're a research intensive university, if we control for discipline, and then we look at everything else, are you a first generation college student? Are you domestic or foreign born, right? Like taking all of these things into account, we find that the biggest predictor is actually having a research assistantship. And this is distinguished from a teaching assistantship or a fellowship. But having that research assistantship is a huge predictor, which makes sense. But again, those are not distributed equally across the population. So when we look at that, we find that women, Hispanic, and Black scholars are far less likely to have a research assistantship than their white counterparts and male counterparts. And Asians are more likely to have these research assistantships than other populations. So this becomes a really interesting point in creating a path dependency. The moment you're accepted into a doctoral program, the source of the funding for you is going to create a path towards attrition in R&D, and so that exclusion inclusion model that happens there. So this becomes a really interesting point, I think, for institutions to think about how we institutionalize disparity. Our selection of resources, the way in which we're allocating resources in the doctoral phase can have huge implications later on. Now, one of the things that interests me the most was in those fellowships that were not necessarily tied to research teams. So what we found is that for many minoritized scholars, they were given fellowships that didn't tie them directly to an advisor or to a research team. And they did not fare as well as their counterparts who received research assistantships because of that socialization into the research process. When you're given an explicit ability to take part in research, to go onto a research team, you're far more likely to have a publication and far more likely to stay in science and in research and development afterwards. Questions on that before we move on?
How do you determine whether somebody's in a research team or not?
So that's just the proxy is the research assistantship. So having a research assistantship as an indicator of being part of a research team, where the implication is for a fellowship, we don't know. They may be part of a research team, they may not be part of a research team, but it's not a required part of their labor.
Right.
Drew,
So
did you have a
Cassidy,
question?
yeah, a follow-up. Oh, did somebody else have their hand raised? I don't want to talk over them.
Go ahead.
Okay. So that assistantship, I mean, the assumption there, or at least the data from probably community science, means within the institution. In other words, if you're part of a research team or research experience in another institution, that wouldn't show up in this, would it?
I'm trying to think about how the question was worded for the survey burn doctorates. And I think it was, what was your primary source of support during your doctoral education? So if they identified a research assistantship from another institution, it would be counted in this as their primary support.
Okay, okay. So it would have been captured.
It should
It
have
did-
been.
Yeah, it just didn't specify like
From
within the institution
Mhm.
where my program of study is housed, or, I mean, as nuanced as that sounds. And the
Yeah.
reason why I'm
It's
asking that-
interesting. No, yeah.
Yeah, the reason why I'm asking is, so the Gardner Institute, it's a not-for-profit, and we do certain forms of fellowships and research support,
Mhm.
and want to grow that over time, but we're not in any college or university anywhere, right? So it's rather pedantic, because I'm thinking, well, how would ours fit into this?
No, but it's interesting, right? And I would love to see, I mean, for your fellowships, do you require an advisor or a host? Is there some way in which they become anchored into the institution, or is this money that they have that is external to and independent of the institution?
Yeah, thank you. You just got me sort of thinking in terms of how we could be more intentional or try to structure. Anyway, I digress. Thank you.
No. It's interesting though. And one of the other forms that we see are Fulbright fellowships too. So anecdotally, just as a director of graduate studies for years and now as a chair, I get a lot of comments from our students who are on Fulbright saying they really crave research socialization. They want to be part of a research team. And we say, well, you can just go grab, join any team, jump on, you're effectively free labor in some ways. And they have this reticence to sort of join on. They don't feel as embedded. They don't feel like as entangled. So it could be interesting for a lot of these sources of funding that are coming from external sources to find ways that we formalize that advisor-advisee relationship so that they feel that they are really part of the team and an integral part of the team.
Yeah, and as we think about it on this end, we're thinking about approaching our fellowships differently with a cohort of fellows, and getting them together in sort of a community of practice around research here. But I think what's important is to connect it back to research with advisors at their home institution. And anyway, I digress. I'm sorry, I'm turning this into this. So what should the Gardner Institute do? Back to you. Yes.
No, that's fine. All right. So let's go to authorship. So let's say you've gotten on this research team, you're embedded in, and now you want to get on one of these scientific papers, right? That we've seen as this big predictor. So, I go from Foucault in his essay, What is an author? He asks, what does it matter who is speaking? And in scholarly communication, it matters a lot, right? We think about authorship as the coin of the realm. And people often think about it as the credit for a discovery, right? Creating that priority claim, giving you an ability to do this, but it's also taking responsibility. When we see fraud or misconduct within the scholarly communication space, it goes back to who the author is. Who is an author on that? But it underlies this entire economy of reputation within higher education. You get on a paper, the place that you are on the paper in a dominant authorship, either first or last, is going to signal to the other world your competencies as a scholar. The citations that are received by that are forms of capital that are embedded into this entire space. So throughout this, we really think about authorship and its centrality in the scientific community, particularly in the academic context. But if we look at authorship, it is not distributed equally. What you see here are gender differences in proportion of authorship using the Web of Science data. And the bluer a country, the more male dominated the authorship. And if there were a country that had female dominated authorship, you'd see it in orange. You see a few that are in the parity zone, that sort of white area. Those countries tend to be countries that have had a large degree of brain drain, where many of the men have left the country for better opportunities or resources elsewhere. In one regression, we took everything we could on country level data to try to understand parity. How could we achieve parity? What would that look like? We threw everything in and we said, what's the biggest predictor of female authorship? And it was male mortality. Now, I do public policy, right? So there's not really a policy outcome with that, right? What do I do with that to say to achieve parity? That's our single greatest predictor. Not very useful for us. So we think about this as the parity paradox. Some places where we see parity are actually places where science has been devalued rather than the other ways. These are not places where we can actually look to solutions, but places where we actually see problems. So this is one of our sort of things that we struggle with when looking at these data. Now you may say, well, you use Web of Science and that's largely the natural or biomedical sciences, so it's used towards men. But if we look across the disciplinary space, we see the same kinds of things. Male domination in math and physics and chemistry, a few more women in biomedical sciences. But given that they've been out matriculating men for about 2 decades, we should expect a larger degree of women in the publication space there, and then male domination in the humanities as well. The places where we see women are in care-related disciplines, nursing, social work, education, library sciences, speech and hearing sciences. Those places, again, that in many cases have devaluation in terms of salaries and prestige and social capital within the higher education space. And so again, it's that parity paradox that we observe. Now, we sent out a large survey to try to understand authorship at a wider range to say, how do you get named an author, and are there gender disparities in this? So we asked people a simple question. How often have you experienced any kind of authorship dispute, that is being named on the paper, the order in which you're named, or being acknowledged? And what was surprising to me is that about a third, a little more than a third of all respondents had had some kind of authorship dispute that they'd encountered. But women experienced them more often, and they were more likely to experience them overall. So we asked them, hold on, let me plug in because I'm losing my battery here. We asked them, okay, what is the biggest predictor of having a dispute? Why do you have a dispute? And both men and women said the same thing. It was different values assigned to the labor of a paper. It is that they believed that there was a different value and that the kinds of contributions that they had weren't being valued. So we said, all right, what do you value? And interesting, for most disciplines, women valued everything more than their male counterparts. They were more likely to say, oh yeah, that's very valuable, that's very valuable, that's very valuable, more than men, except for one category, the technical work. Doing that technical work was something that men placed a higher value on than women. Now that becomes really important later on, so just keep that data point in mind. So then we asked them about authorship discussions. How do you decide who gets to be on a paper? And here too, we found interesting gender dimensions, where men were more likely to discuss authorship at the end of a project with a few key stakeholders or to do it unilaterally, whereas women were more likely to discuss it at the beginning, throughout the process, and with all of the authors. Now, I'm not making a normative assumption about which is better or which is worse, but one has a recency effect and one has a primacy effect, right? If you talk about it at the beginning, it's who's designing the study. It's thinking about who was there at the first. If you're doing it at the end, it's who got it over the finish line, who did those last analyses or visualizations. That's going to have different kinds of value. So these gender differences in timing are going to have effects on who makes it on the byline and where they're placed on the byline. And there are huge consequences to these naming disputes. And what we found is that women were more likely to see isolation, that is to remove themselves from further collaboration or to be removed from further collaboration, whereas men had more aggressive hostility, things of misconduct, of sabotage, of open and aggressive hostility towards one another when they had these disputes. So again, very gendered differences in how both disputes came up and then how they were resolved. Now, this isolation is an interesting piece given other things that we know in scholarly communication. So if we look at just the collaborative works, those things on which there are multiple authors, we can look at this by country in terms of their national versus international collaboration. Now, if you're a smaller country like Switzerland or the Philippines, a large degree of your output is going to be in international collaboration. If you're the US or China, a large degree is going to be in national collaboration. But what's fascinating to me is that invariant, go ahead.
Sorry, but just I want to understand, what do you mean about isolation of female author in collaboration? What does exactly that?
So the point I'm getting to here is that invariant of the countryside, women tend to have more domestic collaborations, than international collaborations. So their collaborations tend to be more nationally located. They don't get the advantage of international collaboration to the same extent that men get as well. So we see two different things, that these disputes are removing them from collaborations. They're less likely to have international collaborations. And other research that we see is differences in team sizes as well. So in many ways, the types of collaboration that we're moving towards put women at a disadvantage in some of these access to resources that are available internationally. Does that make sense, Hussein?
Yeah.
So Hungary is, women are most isolated. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, so they're particularly more likely to be in domestic collaborations relative to their male counterparts.
Okay.
And Cassidy, there was a comment in the chat. Casey, I'm wondering if you want to tell us a little bit more about that.
Well,
You don't have to, I'm just offering.
I am a case study for every single thing that she has said. I have experienced all of it exactly as you described it. I 100% confirm all of your findings from my personal lived experience. All of those
Casey,
things have happened to me.
Thank you, and I'm sorry.
Introduce yourself if you don't mind, real quick.
Yeah, sorry, I was late again to the meeting. My name is Casey Kilbaugh. I'm an engineer by training, chemical engineering. I'm over in the health sciences now doing design thinking, curriculum development. And I work with Greg on lots of fun projects. So he's invited me along to listen to all your wonderful talks.
Thank you, Casey.
Awesome. Thanks, Casey. So one other attribute of that, isolation, and perhaps that's too strong a word, so I will say homophily, is in the composition of these teams. So when we look at the last author to first author, those dominant positions in the natural and biomedical sciences, or if we look at all authors, we find that men tend to have collaborations disproportionately, given the sort of distribution of race, gender, and ethnicity across the space with other men, women with other women. One of the places that we've seen is Asians tend to be more isolated and identified homophily with other Asians rather than falling into the male or female counterparts like our other populations. So we see these different congregations of different individuals based at the intersection of race and ethnicity. This is using US data. So because we're kind of in a more informal conversation, I think this is largely due to the fact that we're not able to identify domestic versus international scholars here. And a lot of that homophily that we're seeing for the Asian population is because these are foreign-born scholars, whereas the other cohorts that we're seeing are largely domestic-born scholars. So it's an interesting kind of play that we're seeing here. And we're using for all of this large-scale disambiguation algorithms. So we're inferring this from the data in Web of Science rather than using social science surveys. Any questions on that before we go on to contributorship?
Yeah, Cassie, it just occurred to me, how do you determine gender of authors?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so for both race and gender, as I said, we use inference based on the names. So for women, for inferring the gender, we tend to use primarily first names, but we do use last names in those countries where they're indicative. So in a lot of the former Soviet countries where the ov or the ova becomes indicative of a gender, we'll infer that kind of data. We use country-based names. So Jean in France becomes male, whereas Jean in the US becomes female. We use census data to look at the probability of that name occurring with a certain gender. And so we take a certain threshold of that. So it's all of these sort of thresholding approaches. Right now, there are several gender disambiguation algorithms that are out there, like Genderize.io, other places where you can use this.
Okay.
For race, it's a little bit trickier. So for race, we just focused on the US. Given that race is a cultural construct, it doesn't make sense to really look at a Latinx population if you're studying South Africa or Spain, right? These things are really culturally controlled, and we're trying to use the classifications within a given country. So in the same way with gender, we use the proportion of the population that falls into one of these categories. But because it's not binary, we have a distribution of a name across different race or ethnicities. And as you know, the US uses both race and ethnicity in the US Census. So you have this distribution where you say, okay, there's 20% that is Asian, 30% that is Black, 40% that is white, and we have this distributional effect. Now, what we tried to do was create a categorization to place people in that by thresholding. But when we test that, what we effectively do is lose the entire Black population. Given the sort of history of slavery in the US, the history of naming in the US, when we start to use these surnames, they're not as distinctive. So Asian names are highly distinctive. We have fairly high probability of assigning that with a threshold-based approach, right? Most of the names are at the 80% above. When you get to white and Black authors, you start to see a lot of overlap in those because of the history of names. Latinx authors are a little bit more indicative, but not as much as the Asian population. So a threshold-based approach really disadvantages certain populations. So instead, we use it distributional. So in all the stuff that you'll see in race later on, we're not assigning a single race to a single individual, but we're looking at the distribution of race over distributions of topics and citations.
Interesting.
So,
Okay.
sorry,
Interesting.
long answer.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Tough problem.
It's a tough problem. And we really want to scale up to global stuff, but it comes really difficult trying to look at race and ethnicity across countries.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so contributorship. So let's say you got through your doctoral education, you actually got named on a paper. Now we're going to look at what you did and how you got named onto that paper. So contributorship was introduced about 2 decades ago, largely by biomedical scholars who said we need to get rid of authorship. It's a really outmoded approach. We need to think about more like the movie reel, right? What did you do to warrant inclusion in this film or in this, work of art? And so moving to that would be this radical change where we would start to identify people with their contributions to an article rather than just listing them. So what we've seen is that certain journals took that up, largely in the biomedical sciences. They began to include a contributor statement, but they would include these sort of in a PDF in the acknowledgement section. And so it was very onerous to go through, download these down, do an OCR process to try to pull them out. So it wasn't until the Public Library of Science began to make them available in an XML format that we could actually go in and try to extract these. Now, they didn't leave authorship behind, they kept that. So you still had your authors, but now you had each of the authors and what they contributed to a piece. Did they conceive and design the experiments, perform the experience, analyze the data, contribute tools, write the paper, and then you have those that are acknowledged. So when they first began doing this, we did an analysis to pull all of these out. Now, at the time, it was really idiosyncratic, right? None of these were written in a standardized way. So we had to go through and try to put them into these 5 main categories. Now, what's fascinating to me is there were about 20,000 other categories that we couldn't fit into one of those 5. So that long tail of contributions, the heterogeneity of scientific work, I found really fascinating. But we did most of our analyses on those big 5. Now, the first thing we wanted to do was understand different isolation of tasks. If you analyze the data, what else are you more likely to do? If you're writing the paper, what are you likely to do? And what we found was that performing the experiments was the most isolated task of all, which is really interesting when we think about fraud and misconduct, right? You have people designing and conceiving the tasks, then you have those doing the experiments and those writing it up. And those were not necessarily the same person. So you have this fragmentation of scientific labor, which I think is a really interesting thing, particularly if you're in high energy physics and you're going up to 5,000 authors, right? What does it mean to actually write a piece of scientific work? So then we started to play with sociodemographic information. Who are these people doing different tasks? And what we found is using their date of first publication as their age, we found what's not going to be surprising to any of you, right? The older you are, the more likely you are to be thinking and designing the experiments, the younger to be performing the experiments. But even when we controlled by age and for size of scientific team and for discipline, we found that women were disproportionately likely to be on the paper because they performed the experimentation, whereas men's authorship was more likely to come from the other tasks. Now, if you remember back to the survey, this is fascinating because this is the one task that women actually valued less than their male counterparts. That is doing the experimentation, doing the kind of technical work in this task. So they think there's a really interesting conversation here where we think about women's work being discredited or devalued, but there's also a sense of their assumed value of their contribution being lower in this way. Now, you may say, okay, but I know you controlled by age, but certainly there are age variables at play here. And it is true, the older you get, the less likely you are to perform the experimentation. But you can see that that line becomes invariant, where women are always doing more of the experimentation than their male counterpart. Analyzing the data is a really interesting switch, where women do more analysis as they age, whereas men do less. And so we see these different patterns that play out over time. Now, you may also say, well, as there are more females in the PI role or in the corresponding author role, we might see shifts on this. But again, really fascinating things. For even when we have women in corresponding author roles, women are more likely to do the experimentation, whereas men are less likely to do it in both for male and female corresponding author roles. And we see the same sort of thing here. I'll kind of skip through this fairly quickly given the time, but we think of the adage, many hands makes light work. And if you look down at the distribution of tasks across authors, when you have male authors with a male lead authors, you see a very tight distribution of tasks. For each author that you add, the proportion of any author doing those tasks decreases. Whereas for women and women on women-led teams, we see that more women are doing all of the tasks for a longer degree of time. So we have more people sort of distributed across tasks than male authors. Now, the credit taxonomy came out a few years ago that really standardized all those contributorship types, and it expanded them beyond that 5 to think more deeply into those spaces, to have formal analysis, investigation, methodology, to take writing from just writing the original draft to reviewing and editing. And when we look at these, we do see very interesting distinctions. So first, from last and middle authors, we find that our first authors are writing the whole thing, doing the data curation, the analysis, the visualization, the investigation, the software, the methodology. Our last authors are more likely to be supervisors, doing funding, resources, and administration. And this falls very neatly along gendered lines as well, whereas our men are more likely to be authors for supervision, for funding, for resources, for conceptualization, whereas our women are more likely to do the methodology, visualization, analysis, writing the whole thing, data curation, and investigation. Now, to me, this is really interesting because when we look at that first graph of the world and we see all that blue, we say, wow, men are really doing scientists. But when we go down into the contributorship type, we see that women are really the hands of science, doing a lot of scientific work, but not necessarily getting the recognition in those dominant author roles. This has huge implications for retention and trajectories in science. So taking those kinds of author roles, we can class people into leadership positions, those who do a lot of the tasks and are in many of that first author roles, those who are specialized, do very specialized tasks within this and tend not to do multiple, and those who do more tool-based or supporting roles. And what we find is that men are more likely to be in those leadership roles and to be them earlier in their career. And this has huge implications for their sustained career. Being a leader early is a strong predictor of staying in science and continuing to be a leader. It is very difficult to move from a specialized or supporting role earlier in your career into those leadership roles later on. So this goes back to that doctoral education space again. It's not just including and socializing doctoral students into research, but giving them opportunities for leadership within that space. Questions on that before we move on? All right, then we'll go on to peer review. So you've gotten through education, you've gotten on the paper, now you have this paper and you're gonna send your baby out for peer review. So we had a really good opportunity to look at eLife, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's a large open access biomedical journal. And it was started in a really interesting way. So someone won a Nobel and they took their Nobel Prize money and they said, scholarly communication is broken and I'm going to fix it. So I'm going to put this money into the founding of a new journal. And this new journal is going to do things the right way. And one of them was changing the way peer review was done. So instead of me taking this piece and giving it to Greg and giving it to Lou, and Greg loves it and Lou hates it, and then I come back to the editor and I write something out and I'm sending it to all of them. Instead, I would say, come here, Greg, come here, Lou, talk about this piece. And on this online platform, they have a conversation about it. They come to a consensus report that I look at too. We edit it and we send it to the author. So they're not getting two different competing versions. They're really getting one thing on whether this should happen or not. So the idea was, does this reduce disparities? So what you see here is the two phases in this. When you go to eLife, you go through that gatekeeping desk reject function effectively, where they either encourage you to submit a full thing or not. So The consultative peer review doesn't come up until after that. Now, 75% of things are rejected before they ever even go into the consultative peer review. And then about 50% of those are rejected after that process. So one of the things we wanted to look at was just, is this a pipeline problem, right? Are people submitting? And it was true that there were fewer women submitting to eLife than would be expected given the population. So about 25% females, where we should expect about 33 to 35% females in this pool. But they were encouraged at a significantly lower rate and accepted at a significantly lower rate. And you may look at 13.6 and 15.4 and say, oh, those aren't huge, but those are actually fairly large differences, and compounded over a career make big differences in the overall sort of trajectory for scientists. Now, what we found was that these discrepancies were largest for females in corresponding or last authored things. So when they seem to be senior authors. And one might argue that these are where your gender is perhaps more widely known than when you are a junior female author. So the first thing we looked at were who the peers were, who is doing the evaluation itself. And I always find this really fascinating. We talk about peer review, but when we look at those who are doing the review and the submitting author pools, they are very different. So in this case, the gatekeepers tended to be more male than the submitting authors, and also more likely to be from North America than the submitting authors themselves. And this has huge implications. So what we found was that when you were a last author who was male, and you went to all male reviewers, you were significantly more likely to be accepted than a last author who was female who went to males. But the exact same thing was true for women as well. Women last authors fared better when they were reviewed by all female authors. Now, it's not significant, and why? Because you only have 21 papers with a female last author reviewed by all women. And when we took out that, when you had mixed gender reviews, we found that there was no difference in the acceptance rate for male or female papers. Now, we found the same kind of homophily bias by country. If you were an Asian author, having just one author from an Asian country significantly increased your likelihood of being accepted. The same was true for Germany, for Switzerland, for the UK, for the US. The one instance was France. If you are French, you do not want to be reviewed by one of your countrymen because they will absolutely destroy your piece. And we found the same thing in Canada, but it was non-significant. So we think it's the Quebecois in Canada really driving that result. So, I mean, French people, I mean, it's a culture of criticism. That's really a problem. But we have this, I know, it's my song.
What did you say? Sorry, Sherry?
I didn't make a point. No,
I was just making a comment that Cassidy, there's a collaborator who is in Montreal, and I was kind of pointing that out.
I'm just curious, does blinding submissions help? It must, right? I mean, does eLife have a blind review, double blind?
No, so they're using single blind reviews. So that was one of the things that came out of this, is our recommendation to them was to try blinding to see what happens when you blind it.
Okay.
So, you know, one person could say, well, then homophily advantages everyone, right? Women preference women, men preference men, you know, Germans preference other Germans. But the probability of homophily is not equally distributed across the population. In the case of eLife, if you submit your paper and you're from the US, there's a 91% chance someone else from the US is going to be reviewing your paper. If you're from the UK, that drops dramatically. And when you start going to other countries, China, India, Israel, the probability of having someone else who has that homophilic bias really decreases dramatically. So when we think about how bias enters in here, it really comes into part of that, how representative those gatekeepers are of the population that they're reviewing. So last slide on that, you know, when we take everything and throw it in, what are the biggest predictors of just getting through the door? Well, being from a top institution and being male. Then if you get through the door, being from a top institution, being male, and being reviewed by all men. And so this is where we see those kinds of discriminatory practices coming into the evaluation of science. Questions before we move on? All right, so I know we're coming on time, so I'll try to keep it quick. All right, so differences in impact. So this paper has finally gotten reviewed. Let's say you weren't rejected because you were a man and you were reviewed by all men. And this goes out. How does the scientific community receive your work? And I'm very careful to think about citations as receptions, as visibility, how the scientific community utilized your work rather than any indicator of quality, which we'll get to in a second. And what we find is the worst thing is to be a woman and write alone. Those are the lowest cited papers across all. But even when we have collaborations, that national and international collaboration, if there is a woman in the first or last authored position, they are less cited than men in first or last authored position. So again, going back to that thing of women being more likely to have national than international collaborations, this creates a compound disadvantage. Women are less likely to have international collaborations, which yield higher citations. And even when they do, they're cited to a lesser degree. This is compounded again when we look within the US context and race and ethnicity. So as I said before, that distributional effect can look at the likelihood that a surname is associated with race. And we see that within race and ethnicity, women tend to be less cited than their male counterparts. But what to me is the most sort of striking and horrifying result is looking at the Black and Hispanic scholars. As soon as a name is highly indicative of a Black or Hispanic scholar, the citations drop dramatically, right? You see that sort of cliff that they fall on for both women and for men, that we see that cliff really indicating that there is something that's going on. Now you can say, oh, but a disambiguation algorithm may not be accurate and it's not at the individual level. But to me, that's even more important, is that these are perceptions of race or ethnicity from the people who are reading scientific work. You read a thing and you see a Smith versus another name, and that's going to make you have an implication about the veracity of the work, the validity of the work, and whether you're going to cite it. So there are things coming out in this perception that lead to these both implicit and explicit biases that have huge implications for the reward system of science. Now we see again differences by different countries. Certain countries, women are more likely to be cited than their male counterparts, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and a few other countries. Now you may say, well, women should just put their stuff in better venues. If only women published in Science and Nature and PNAS, they would receive these higher citations. They're not placing their work right. So as much as I hate the journal impact factor, which we can talk about later, we took this and looked at the impact factor of the journals in which they published relative to the citations that received. And as you can see for the first authored things, for Earth and Space, for biology, for engineering, for social sciences, women are actually publishing in journals of higher impact factor than their male counterparts. And yet, even then, their work is cited at a lower rate. Now you may say, well, you're using averages and citations are highly skewed. So let's take it to deciles. And if we look at the decile of the impact factor, in the lowest decile, there's very little difference. Men are cited at a slightly higher rate on average. But as you move up those deciles and get higher and higher, the gap widens. And in fact, it's the highest at the top. It's in the Science and Nature and PNAS and Cell that we see the biggest division. So women are getting into these journals with acceptance rates of less than 5%, and yet their work is cited at a lower degree. And I think that starts to distinguish for that quality argument, right? You have to be at a certain quality to get through that selection mechanism, and now your receipt is lower within the scientific space. Now, I want to take a quick moment to go back to homophily, because I think that this is a really interesting thing here. If we look at how people reference work and the citations that we receive, we see large degrees of homophily along different dimensions. So if we look at the continent, those from scholars from Asia are more likely to both reference and be cited by other Asian scholars. And the same is true for Europeans, for North Americans, for Australians. We see the same kinds of patterns. You can break it down to country and you see the same thing. The plurality of the references and citations that are given and received are coming from people within your own country. That's a very strong sort of homophily geographic proximity bias. But we also see that at the intersectional space of race and gender, where Latinx men disproportionately receive their citations from other Latinx men, Asian men, etc. Now you may say again, oh, but everybody benefits. But if we think about the majority minority populations in science, the probability that you can receive another citation from someone of your same race or ethnicity is not equally distributed across the population. So then these homophilies have huge implications later for the receipt of citations. Questions before we move on to the last place?
Yeah, just before, what about self-citation? Are men more likely to self-cite?
They are. So, and we've done analyses to look at that. So men are more likely to self-cite, but it doesn't explain all of the citation difference that we receive. So it does explain part of it, but there is still a residual after that. And we often like to take self-citation out too. So there's self-citation as the individual, but then there's the citation from your other collaborators, right? So your paper is getting a self-citation as a paper, and then we can kind of move out to your co-authors, your collaborators, and move out. Men do benefit from each of those nested networks, but even when controlling for all those things, it doesn't explain all the residual difference between male and female's total citation rates.
Interesting.
All right, so funding. So last thing is funding. So we look at this in two different ways. One, using Web of Science acknowledgement data, we can just see a binary thing. Is there a funding acknowledgement or not? And here we actually see a really interesting space where women are more likely to be funded in terms of that binary funding acknowledgement in clinical medicine, social sciences, engineering, mathematics, physics, many of the places where women are actually deeply minoritized. They are more likely to have that funding acknowledgement. In many of the biomedical sciences and chemistry, psychology, health, men are more likely to have that acknowledgement. Now we can look at this at lots of different levels, by the country level, by institution level, all of those things can be played out to see both within and across disciplines, how likely we are to see articles that have an acknowledgement. Now we also did this just looking at the US using academic analytics data, where we could dig down into a few of the different kinds of funding agencies. So they include all of the major US funding agencies, as well as the large major foundation funding that comes in. And that's where we start to see a slightly different thing. So as before, we can see that the proportion holding at least one grant in medical sciences, men were more likely, whereas in engineering, women were more likely. So that reinforces that Web of Science data that we saw before. However, if we look at the size of the grant, we see that women's grants were much smaller than their male counterparts. Now, the averages and the medians are actually not so far off, but it's in those outliers. Men were much more likely to get the massive grants that really propelled them out in this space. So the huge center, the research excellence grants were more likely to go to men in almost every discipline than to women. Now, we also looked at this by age, because you could say, well, men are just older, so they're receiving the larger grants because they're there. And what we find is those who received their PhD in or before 1975, there is no difference between men and women in their proportion holding grants. So you can look at that as sort of a selection effect. If you've stayed in the scientific workforce that long, there's very little difference. But it's actually in the younger cohorts that we see the biggest discrepancies, with men more likely to hold grants. And this is different by different disciplines. In the natural sciences, there's relatively little difference in the most recent cohort in the likelihood of holding a grant. But in the medical sciences, that is huge. And to me, that's a really scary kind of outcome, which we'll talk about a little bit later with these epistemic inequalities and how they play out. All right, so epistemic gaps. So we're going to kind of shift a tiny bit to think not about just who's producing research, but the kind of research that they're producing, to look at the effects and the consequences of diversity. So this was a fun data set where we used PubMed Central, and we used their mesh headings, where they tell us the sample, the population that they used and that they studied. So we're able to look at whether they took sex into account, and then whether they used male or female populations in their study. Now, if you look at biomedical research, you can see that almost all of it doesn't report on sex. They don't take it into account as an analytic variable. And you may say, yeah, but it's at the cellular level, so why does it matter? But we know that there's a difference in cells in their absorption of lipids, their responses to stress, and the majority of drugs withdrawn from the market are withdrawn because they have adverse effects on women. And it's largely argued that this is because they weren't tested on women, or sex wasn't taken into account. Now, the National Institute of Health and other agencies advocated for sex inclusion and for studying both men and women in their populations. And you can see that that's had a dramatic effect over the last decade in terms of the inclusion of both sexes in research studies. Now, you can kind of see some face validity in this. In gynecology, you're much more likely to study women. In urology, you're going to study men. But then we see in physiology, you're much more likely to study men. In pharmacology, much more likely to study men. So each of these have potential adverse effects. Now, when we overlay that by the gender of the authors, we see something really interesting. Women are significantly more likely to take sex into account, and significantly more likely to both study women and to study both sexes. And that is increased significantly when you have a woman in both first and last authorship roles. So to me, this is a really interesting finding that inclusion of women in the biomedical sciences isn't just about justice, it's about science, right? It increases the amount that we know about women. And given that women make up 50% of the population and 100% of the birthing population, this seems relatively important for society. Now we see a very similar thing in terms of homophily on topic space when we go to race. So I'll skip through this fairly quickly, but to say that we see different representations by the intersection of race and ethnicity, and that we see different citation differentials. So minoritized populations are more likely to appear in disciplines that have lower citation rates. And even when they are in highly cited disciplines, they are cited at a lower degree within those spaces. And we can see that this creates kind of a scaffolding across all of that. But what I want to get to is this slide, where we look at the distribution of topics by the feminization and the racialization of that space. And again, we see elements of that homophily, where Latinx populations are significantly more likely to look at topics that identify with their lived experience. Asian scholars are more likely to look at China as a topic. Black scholars more likely to look at Africa or African American culture as their topics. So again, the change in the scientific workforce has a change in the composition of the topics that are studied. So in a very back of the napkin kind of analysis, we said, let's say that the scientific workforce looked like the US population in terms of representation. What would that look like? Well, about 30% more articles on public health, 20% more on gender-based violence, 18% more on tropical diseases, and 17% more research on families. So again, changing who does science changes what we know. So I'm going to end on that and kind of just go for some recommendations, but I won't read through each of these here because I'd love to chat with all of you about things that we can do to get to that kind of diversity and representation that we want. And I want to also thank my colleague that was mentioned earlier, the Quebecois, who's bringing down all other French-speaking Canadians. But he has been my co-author on all of these papers, so I would be remiss not to acknowledge him here. Thank you.
That was great, Cassidy. Thank you.
Amazing. Yeah.
This is my impression of a Zoom emoji. So let's just open the floor. Comments, questions?
Yeah, can I start? Maybe I don't know this information, maybe others doesn't. How did you measure the impact of paper, like the impact factor?
Yeah, so for the two different measures we use field normalized and raw citations. So the amount of citations that come to a paper, and then field normalized citation indicators, where you look at the citation rate of other articles published within that subtopic within that given year to control for both year and specialty. For impact factor of the articles, we looked at the journals in which they were published. And you can take that over time as an average, or you can take it within sort of the last recorded impact factor. So we have a database that has sort of the impact factor of journals since the 1970s, so we can look at it through all of those spaces.
Cassidy, a lot of our work here, the overwhelming majority at the Gardner Institute is focused on undergraduate students. And but of course we work with faculty at all levels, from not tenured to, full professors. And we work with a lot of graduate students as well who are working with undergrads or doing research. But I'm wondering if you've thought about, or if you already have done work that examines the role of undergraduate research in all of this, right? And if so, what are you doing, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll say that no, we have not dug into that as much as I would like, but we are seeing an intensification of research experience for undergraduates, and that is serving as huge predictors of those students going into graduate school as well, and being really quite a pivotal thing for first generation college students, which I think is a really important element in terms of that socialization into research. So our work hasn't looked at that. Again, we use largely publication data data sets, but what we are seeing is that we weren't, I mean, the amount of undergrads that were appearing in these publications was relatively low. Now we're starting to see that increase as we go down. So I think that is a role we'll have to think about more. We see it a little bit in our surveys, but not much. But there are other people doing phenomenal work in that area. So I think it's a really interesting area of research right now.
Other questions, comments, discussion?
Critiques,
Casey, did you want to add
insults.
anything to your prior comments, or?
Well, I do that only in French, and I need to brush up on that.
No, Casey had.
Well, Cassidy, I'm wondering, do you have someone to partner with who has done qualitative explorations of interviews and focus groups and to uncover, I mean, I'm an anecdotal example that the things that you're uncovering in this large data set are absolutely happening on the ground. But it would be interesting to actually be able to bring some of that to light more.
Yes, that's, to get a little too personal and anecdotal, but I just had a call yesterday. We have a fabulous colleague within the School of Public Policy, Julia Melkers, who does a lot more interview work and more qualitative and ethnographic work. And we were just saying the same thing, is that she said, I really want to bring in what you have. And I'm like, I want to bring in what you have and do that better. Just to tell you how perhaps naive we were in this. I didn't show the data from our parenting survey that we did, which is really fascinating, particularly given COVID. But we sent out this survey about parenting obligations for men and women. And it was a very quantitative survey. And at the end, we just had this open text box. Hey, do you have anything else? We thought we'd get a couple. Thousands of responses in that, long responses about parenting and academe, right? And we haven't even begun to analyze that data. Yeah. So I think it definitely shows us that our approach is really only able to give a very high level macro view, and there is a demand to dig deeper into that. So yes, I welcome all those partnerships. And it's very interesting to me as well.
Wonderful. I'm glad to hear that you're already thinking in that direction, because it would be a beautiful synergy between the two spaces. Yeah.
Agreed.
So I'm wondering, go ahead, Greg.
Well, I was just going to say, if you could pull up your last slide again very quickly. I thought, so what do we do about this problem, particularly, folks who are in leadership positions at universities, right? The very last slide, which of these do you think is most important?
All of them. I really do. And I don't say that facetiously. I think that this takes a systematic and systemic look to addressing these issues. I think we can't just say, oh, let's leave it to the funders. No, funders have a lot of levers that they can pull. And I think, having federal initiatives, having funding initiatives, they make huge differences in scholarly communication, as we've seen before. I think academic institutions need to think about many of these things and the ways in which they can both value different kinds of labor, that they can incentivize different things, they can reconceptualize this ideal worker that we have and provide resources to allow everyone to thrive in higher education. So there's a lot that we can do in terms of both culture and practice and policy within institutions. P&T committees, I come back to this, our evaluation structure is part of the biggest problem through all of these things. How we evaluate people, how we determine what has value within science really drives a lot of these things that we can see. But I also feel like it's really problematic when we sort of blame institutions. Oh, it's the state, it's the funder, it's the institution, it's broken. But science is a self-organizing system. So we have to take ownership ourselves. What are we doing in our own labs? And even in the course of doing this research, I'm consistently aware of when I do these same things in my lab, when I give voice to certain populations, when I give leadership to certain populations, when I select on applicants in certain ways using variables that I know are actually coded for other kinds of attributes. So I think it's something we have to all be constantly aware of in all of our evaluative processes.
Maybe a better way for me to phrase it. I mean, I think, research is for minoritized communities, recruitment, some of these things folks have been trying to do for years, but other things I see on this list are not things that are maybe that that well socialized at the moment, of, you know, focusing on contribution rather than venue. These types of things, I think there needs to be education in some of these other areas.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And I think, you know, I didn't, given time, I cut out a lot of the slides on the pandemic, but I think the pandemic's been really interesting in making manifest many of these things that existed already. It wasn't as if we suddenly said, oh, wow, women are doing disproportionate care burdening in the pandemic, and they never were before. They were before. You know, scholars of color were also having these different kinds of care responsibility before. And so because of COVID, institutions are rethinking their P&T process entirely. And I think in doing that, we're actually addressing some longer term problems that we should have addressed before.
Congress might even want to think about expanded family leave.
Exactly.
I'm sorry, it's too soon. I'm angry.
No,
Well,
seriously. I was like, it's a huge issue. I mean, and our parenting survey was a global survey, and I mean, you see the differences very clearly.
Oh, are you hopeful?
I am hopeful. But I'm also hopeful, but that doesn't make me any less radical, I should say. I think too often we say, hey, things are organically changing. That's great. Look at them change. More women are coming in. But we don't see the kinds of changes at the upper levels of the scientific workforce that we would expect just given the organic changes in the input. So this says we still require some of these more radical approaches. I tend to be a big fan of quotas. I believe in some of these more sort of radical reconceptualizations of evaluative processes in order to overcome what has not been a meritocratic process for decades.
Yeah, it's all built into the system. The system will continue to run exactly as it does, no matter what you put into it.
Exactly. Exactly.
I heard an interesting comment. I was at a College of Sciences advisory board meeting, and our Dean Susan Lozier, one of the questions was, why does this undergraduate student body look so diverse? Like, you walk around any campus right now, it's a very diverse set of students, and yet our faculty are, and Susan had a really interesting observation. She goes, she's not trying to lay claim to knowing the answer, but she said that one of the differences to think about is that students don't select themselves.
Yeah.
But faculty members do select themselves, and there's a natural human bias for people to select people who think and look and are like you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know how I mean, there's a radical thought that faculty don't select who the other faculty are. What would that look?
Yeah, Lou, I agree with you on that faculty selecting themselves. I'd offer a friendly amendment that on one level, the interactions in and around classrooms do lead to students at least deselecting themselves, right?
Yeah.
So, and I'm not trying to challenge you there. I'm going to throw something else out here real quick, but so Shawi and Greg and Hayden B. Free to some extent were involved in a chapter we did, a virtual chapter in a series we did on socially just design and post-secondary education. They did it around the curriculum. We had to make some choices this year in the first time of doing it, you know, on where we focus. And some of it was just based on convenience. Who do we know was doing work that examined design, unjust design, and socially just design in the undergrad experience? And in this given case, we did it on the curriculum. We did others. One was on academic labor. We didn't examine scholarship. So fair warning, we're thinking about what we're going to do in 2022 and 2023. And now there's the convenience of knowing some good people who are interested in this, right? So, you know,
No, I love it. I think that decolonizing the curriculum is such an important point, but, you know, to lose what I would love to do, I mean, because I'm still an empiricist in all this, I would love to run a study where you have a search committee for a new faculty position that is run by the faculty and one that's entirely appointed by the provost outside of it, and see what the outcome looks like. Who ends up being the top candidates? What does it look like, right? I would like to see more experiments where we play with the composition of who writes the job ads. Let's even let the faculty serve on the search committee, but have someone else write a job ad and see what we get, right? We haven't done enough of these kinds of experiments to say, you know, as Greg implied, okay, yeah, recruit more. No, like, let's actually take radical interventions into the processes that we have, and then test them empirically. We're scientists, see what the outcomes are.
Right. All right.
Wonderful.
And increase male mortality. I've got that as an action item.
You know, it's
And avoid the
funny,
French.
Lou. Yeah, when I was at Purdue, for many years I had an office in the basement. That lets you know how much I was valued, right? And it was a place where like they put fledgling folks like me, as well as like some of the dinosaurs. So there were a bunch of like retired VPs, and they never talked to me, right? And then one day, this Jen, who had been VP for student affairs, but had come out of engineering, because that's where all the VPs for student affairs came from at Purdue for the longest time, like just passed me on the way into a restroom. And he just said, you know, Drew. And I'm like, I do know Drew, that's me, right? But I didn't know he knew me, right? And so I was like, holy cow, he knew me. And he's like, you know what this place could benefit from? And I was like, still really puzzled, particularly since we're going in and out of the restroom. I didn't know he knew me. He said, a few good retirements and a lot of good funerals. And then he just kept walking, right? So it reinforces entirely what you're saying, Cassidy. And Lou, we have to work on a plan. So yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Although
right.
this
Thank
was
you.
recorded, so we're
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
Greg,
yeah.
you were supposed to stop the recording right before.
Okay,
Yes.
stop the recording, Wilson.
No, thank you, Cassidy. Let me just tell you again, this is great work. It's very